Hi, I'm Bob the Hollow, here to talk about Cainhurst Castle and the Vile Bloods. The undead queen and her spreading corruption have long been a topic of obsession for theorists, and we have all, at one point or another, tried to brave the depths of their lore. This is my interpretation of the story, hidden inside these echoing, abandoned halls. Just like the Temerian Labyrinth, Cainhurst itself is also frozen in time. Its story isn't like a moving picture, it's more akin to a painting instead. Each brushstroke is another bar in the gilded cage that keeps its narrative. Each stroke is a connection to the outside world. Combined, they will provide us with the map that is required to navigate its intricate lore, a map that points first and foremost to the Tomb of the Gods and the Bloodqueens of the Labyrinth. The first connection comes from the entities that Cainhurst shares with the Labyrinth, namely the Bloodleakers, the lost children of antiquity, and the Forsaken Castle and evil Labyrinth spirits. At first glance, the Bloodleakers are usually assumed to be drawn to large quantities of blood, any kind of blood, but the Labyrinth shows that they are drawn to the blood associated with the Temerians, ignoring the blood of beasts. The lost children of antiquity are assumed to be the old nobles of Cainhurst turned to beasts, as mentioned in the Hytar Palace's description, but they can also be found in the lower depths of the Temerian Labyrinth. I believe the head trophies in Cainhurst Castle may be what Cainhurst beasts would have looked like, left behind as pieces of decadent art, and yes, the lost children would also have been old nobles at some point, but they aren't beasts, they're something else. Forsaken Castle and evil Labyrinth spirits, while not being ghosts left behind by the same people, are still the only ghosts that can be found in the game, drawing another distinct connection. And this group of our enemies can be further interconnected by another factor, the righteous damage. This is a hidden type of bonus damage that has no official name, but that has been dubbed righteous due to the fact that all weapons that possess such damage are from the church, and the fact that the damage is applied to enemies that are considered denizens of Cainhurst. But I think righteous isn't really a befitting name, considering that not all church weapons sport this bonus damage, and that some of these creatures are clearly not from Cainhurst. But any way you choose to look at it, the righteous damage is only applied to these 4 creatures that breach the gap between Cainhurst and the Labyrinth below. But the Labyrinth isn't the only one making its way above ground. This liaison works both ways. Before there was a workshop, there was Gehrman, and before Gehrman, the first hunter, in his peculiar choice of hunting attire, there were ironclad knights. There are scores of dead knights in steel plate armor scattered around the Labyrinth. Labyrinth warriors wear chainmail instead of plate armor, and these skeletons are too small to be Temerian. They look very human-like instead. These aren't Temerian armors. These are the shining Cainhurst armors on display at the entrance to Annalise's quarters. Before Bergenworth ever came to be, Cainhurst nobles had already braved the labyrinthine depths. There are unlooted rooms inside the labyrinth, tucked away in hard-to-find corners. If the labyrinth is a glimpse into the past, these rooms are a glimpse into unspoiled Temerian culture. Here, we can find 2 items that can also be found in Cainhurst, the golden horns and the silver queen figurines. These rooms are unlooted, but the rest of the labyrinth is not. There must have been much to be gained from its exploration, and the clad knights of Cainhurst were sacrificed for the treasures that they brought back, filling the coffers of Cainhurst nobility. Even old nobles seem to have been accounted within these ranks, and in the deepest reaches, right keepers would have turned them into the monstrous bat-like creatures that we meet. Old, fire-based Temerian rituals had been used before to transform those who had sinned against the old lords into eternal guardians of the labyrinth, and it seems that a similar ritual has been used once more. In this particular location, for instance, the right keepers look over their creations, who would have flown in and out of the once barred pit below, where they were fed trapped victims, the pit, now, filled with corpses alone. And amidst all that, even a small detail of Temerian fashion seems to have found its way into Cainhurst noble attire. But the biggest connection between Cainhurst and the Labyrinth has to be Queen Annalise herself. Besides her physical resemblance to the Temerians, the fact that she recognizes the Ring of Betrothal, and the fact that both herself and Yarnin are called Bloodqueens, the following, I believe, should also be considered. The first, least substantial connections come from Queen Yarnan Fight's soundtrack, which is called Queen of the Vile Bloods, and her babe's grab attack, which shares an animation with the Headless Forsaken Castle Spirit's attack. Then, there are the weapons wielded by the Keepers of the Old Lords in the Shadows of Yarnan, who carry a katana-like sword very similar to the Cainhurst Royal Guard's Chikage, a connection where all three groups would have similar duties, the last two, in particular, being royal bodyguards. And as a side note, the Chikage's original name is also a real-world Japanese feminine name, making it the perfect match for the aptly named pistol Evelyn. The Shadows of Yarnan and Annalise's royal guards provide another connection in the form of the rune Blood Rapture, which is dropped by both. This rune resonates with servants of the Queen, carrier of the Child of Blood, who yearn for their Queen's blood with little hope for requitement. For them, they find solace in Blood Rapture, that serves as a surrogate for their desires. This description serves as a reference to both Blood Queens, as both are being kept away from their servants. Now, we'd have the literal figure of Temerian monarchy, the little silver queen figurine. This figure can be found prominently displayed in Cainhurst Castle. Here, large statues of the figurative Temerian queen can be found literally everywhere, and this overt display significantly emboldens the direct connection between Bloodqueen Annalise and the Bloodqueen lineage of the Temerian labyrinth. And lastly we have Lauren. I have already talked about Lauren's curse, and I think that concept extends to Annalise herself. The bastard of Lauren is said to be a harbinger of curses and symbol of defilement. Annalise's own flesh is stated to be cursed, and I believe that, considering her undying nature, the Immortal Queen is the original Queen of Lauren, or, at the very least, a descendant of her bloodline, defiled by Odin, as she surrendered herself to her. Yarnan may have been betrothed to Flora, but Annalise will have none of that. Now, besides the Queen, the last connection actually comes from one very unlikely place: silver. Silver itself is rather scarce, and the connection easily goes unnoticed, but it becomes clear once you've grouped and analyzed all related items. The game first draws attention to it with the silver armor of Annalise's protectors, the Cainhurst Royal Guards, and by attributing special properties to the element from which they are made. These properties are further implied by the common use of quicksilver bullets, but we'll get to those in a bit. Next, we have the choir bell, a small silver bell that grants vigor and healing. Healing doesn't look like a thing that would be associated with Annalise at first, but it may be the key to her immortality. Alfred can beat her to a pulp all on his own, which begs the question of, why is she whole when we first meet her? Surely Logarius and his executioners would have tried to end her, but here she stands, alive and well. It comes to reason the assumption that they did, in fact, kill her, but she just wouldn't die. Unlike Yarnan, whose consciousness can outlive her body, Annalise's body is undying. Even in the mangled state that Alfred leaves her, her flesh still lives, and can be revived at the altar of despair. But Logarius obviously wouldn't have revived her, even if he had the means to, so, over time, her body would have healed on its own instead. And after what I can only imagine would have been countless attempts at ending her life, they decided to imprison her inside her mask, and leave her locked inside her quarters, hidden behind Logarius' sacrifice. The small choir bell is fashioned after a bell that projects an arcane sound across planes of existence, and that original bell would be keeping Annalise alive. I'm not sure yet, but I suspect that, much like the mad bell-ringing women of the labyrinth use their bells to summon creatures from other worlds, the original bell from which the choir bell draws its healing powers may have been used by the inhabitants of Floran to commune with Odin. The healing factor can be taken further still. The corruption rune grants healing near death. Pulsing blood gems that provide healing are associated with Lauren, the land from which Annalise would have come from, and the doll, in the hunter's dream, who supposedly are a creation of Maria, distant relative to the undead queen, sheds a silver, shining tearstone, and the tear blood gem within grants healing to its wielder. The bells come from the labyrinth, and from that same labyrinth we get two other connections, the Temerian chalices and the queen's figurine. That figurine, as I have stated before, is made of silver, plain and simple. And the Temerian chalices range from the outskirts at depth 1 to their capital Lihil at depth 5. The deeper you go, the closer you get to the capital, the queen, and the great ones. It would be logical for the deeper chalices to be more valuable, but while most of them are golden, the great Tumiru Ihil chalice is silver, making silver more valuable than gold for their culture. Going back to our first examples and the righteous bonus damage, I'd like to point out something that has been noticed by others before. All righteous weapons sport engraved runes or silver parts, and since this damage affects an interior monster, such as the evil labyrinth spirit, it is well possible that this power originates from an incantation weaved into the weapon or from the silver itself. Ludwig's Holy Blade and the Holy Moonlight Sword are simply stated to be made of silver, even though the latter is only hinted at in the description of the former. The Kirk hammer only deals this damage in its silver sword form, even though the engravings are on the hammer portion of the weapon, and the spokes of the Logarius' wheel seem to be made of silver, which leaves only the threaded cane and the church peak. The peak isn't stated to be made of silver, but it is called a sword, and church swords are known to be made of silver, while the cane is wielded by a choir member, the choir being the owners of the small silver bells. These last two weapons present a very flimsy connection. They may not be made of silver at all, so I'll leave this one up for interpretation and move on to the last part instead, the Quicksilver bullets. Quicksilver bullets themselves must be fused with blood, scaling with blood tinge, which sounds an awful lot like Cainhurst craftsmanship to me. And they can also be associated with Odin, since the only runes that influence these bullets are Formless Odin and Odin Wraith. Odin has already been connected to Annalise's lore in my previous video, and blood tinge itself may present a connection of its own between Cainhurst and Lauren. Evelyn's description states Cainhurst's preference for weapons with high blood tinge scaling, and they have a unique droplet warm gemstone stashed in a chest, while, inside the labyrinth, blood leakers will drop more warm blood gems when they are found in Lauren. But why silver? Why Quicksilver? Here, I'd like to add an outside reference for your appreciation. But first, a disclaimer that, in my opinion, references that cannot be found in game should never be quoted as canon. They can be very interesting, they can provide insight into the minds of the developers, and they can be seen as an extra argument to help support an already firmly established theory, but you should never build a theory upon one, and you should never expect that people accept them one way or another. So, I believe silver is used as a symbol to breaking the barriers that separate us from the higher planes we so desperately look for. Quicksilver, or mercury, is a metal that is liquid at room temperature. Once, it was believed to be one of the elemental principles and that it would have been present in all metals. It's been used in medicine, where it was believed to have healing properties, and in alchemy, where it would have occult properties that would allow transmutation or metamorphosis from one element to another, and it was used in attempts to turn base metals into gold. In Bloodborne, water is presented as the barrier that separates worlds, and the liquid property of quicksilver, which, in Japanese, is written by combining the kanjis for water and silver, would be used to access the inherent properties inside the blood, which is said to be a medium of the highest grade, and, being a medium, that would imply that blood itself is a bridge to something else. Mercury dissolves the barrier that is the blood and is fused to it. When you shoot a beast with a quicksilver bullet, it's not the quicksilver itself that deals the damage, and it's not the blood either, it's the higher power found inside of them. In Roman mythology, the god Mercury was, among other things, responsible for taking departed souls to the underworld, making him, in practice, a medium between higher and lower planes of existence. His name is sometimes thought to have its origins on the Latin word margo, which means boundary, and he would be the keeper of such boundaries. This last part, in particular, makes me think of Murgo as the boundary between mortals and great ones, and the wet nurse as its keeper. His winged helmet can be associated with Maria's feathered head, and in a Roman poem called Metamorphoses, he is described as bringing dreams from Somnus to humans in deep sleep, and also as having impregnated the nymph Lara, who gave birth to the Lares deities, invisible masters and protectors of individual separate domains. And lastly, there is his symbol, This symbol is largely utilized to represent the amalgamation of genders, another breaking of barriers. In alchemy, it's been used to represent the mind portion of the three primes, the formless portion of ourselves. And in Bloodborne, it is the base upon which the carrier rune corruption is built from. Before moving on, I'd like to address Annalise's position as Queen of Cainhurst. I think her existence was kept a secret. This is the most logical conclusion, actually. They simply couldn't tell the world that they were ruled by an undead. That would have been madness. So, the king and queen posed as rulers, while Annalise ruled from the shadows, and, judging by her manner of speech and lifespan, she's been doing it for a very long time now. This explains why we can find the Pthumerian figurines in Cainhurst but not in Yharnam. It explains why the king has golden figurines instead of silver, considering we've already established that, for this particular culture, the latter was more valuable. And it also explains certain peculiarities regarding the many statues scattered throughout castle grounds. There are 4 statues, the king and queen, Annalise, represented after the Pthumerian model, and this other crownless, naked statue. They are all very haphazardly arranged with varying random heights, and any kind of pattern is very hard to be discerned. But there are 2 instances that may shed some light into the relationship presented between them. First, at the doors to the main hall, we have the king and Annalise, but the queen is nowhere to be found. Then, we have the fountain next to the lamp. Here, again, we have the queen and Annalise, but no queen, and the queen's position in relation to the Bloodqueen is suddenly unmistakably clear. Also, standing above them is the crownless statue, and I think this is the representation of Odin. Odin is genderless. The peasants had their own vision of what Odin would look like, but that's just how they chose to portray the Great One, a very stereotypical representation of the father figure that dominates most religions, and this would be Cainhurst's portrayal of Odin, watching over its domain. Somewhat rooted in classical deific representations, more akin to the matriarchal society of the Pthumerians, and slightly reminiscent of the Lares that I mentioned before. When it comes to Cainhurst, it seems that people tend to forget that royalty doesn't exist in isolation from the land. That's just not how royalty works. A castle with a king and queen filled with noble families would most certainly rule over the surrounding settlements. Hamwick, Old Yharnam, and the village in the Forbidden Woods immediately come to mind. It seems to me that the village in the woods provided food for the nobles and the other settlements, from hunting and grains, judging by the butchers and windmills respectively. Old Yharnam would have been the local hub for peasant residency. It lacks most of the architectural cues that its more modern counterpart, Central Yharnam, has taken from Cainhurst, but its architecture is a lot more elaborate than the other 2 settlements nonetheless. It's big enough to have its own heraldry, being over the administration of one lord or another, but it still hints at being under the rule of royalty. And it seems to be the old center for religion, housing the local parish church. Hamwick provided and cared for the horses. It was also the crossing from which outsiders could reach the castle, and it provided the first line of defense with an imposing stone building that overlooks the rest of the settlement and the way to Cainhurst. This is a picture of this land as it stood in a bygone time, but eldritch creatures would rise from the ground. As we have established, the Nightmare Frontier is a curse born from Lore's defilement. We see, in the labyrinth, the tombstones left by the Pthumerians, but not the ones either preceding or born from this eldritch liaison. But we can find them in the Frontier, and we can find them in the Forbidden Woods. In those woods, we can also find the Hintertomb snakes, the main eating boars from Loren, Beast Roar, which is also associated with that land, and a toxic lake contaminated by the poison that seeps from the labyrinth below, infested with the parasites that can be found in both Loren Silver Beasts and Cainhurst Castle. Surrounding that lake, there are the cold blood flower buds associated with the death that engulfed the tragic land. Here, Pthumerians, the Ashen Blood Sickness, and the Scourge of the Beast met with the race of men once more. A new dawn came from the ever-expanding Hintertombs. digging upwards from above ancient Loren, dragging along the lost remnants of its once great civilization. Feeding on beast blood and largest animals, as we can see with the boars, the crows and the snakes, there's also a giant tree ripping apart the tower at the entrance to the woods. The ground itself is poisonous here, contaminated by incoagulable beast blood shedding an age long past. They were stricken by a new, baffling disease, ashen blood, and like I said, these woods provided food for the surrounding areas, and with meat and grain, they spread the disease. The same disease referenced by the iron descriptions that mention traces of magical procedures in Loren. The ashen blood sickness was literally bloodborne. But Annalise's blood was their salvation. Ariana's blood is Cainhurst blood, and it's as powerful as any blood saint's healing. Little did they know that blood would be both their deliverance and their undoing. Annalise and the witches, descendants of the old Rite Keepers, brought with them the worship of an invisible god called Odin. Inside their cathedral, they found a holy grail, worshipped by men out of superstition. In their hands, a mere trinket from ancient ruins. In the hands of Annalise, the key to the tomb of the gods themselves. Rumors quickly reached the lords in the castle, and she was brought before them. Annalise, the outsider. Annalise, the new source of their power, their riches, and dreams of communion. Annalise, the new, invisible queen of Cainhurst. Exploration of the underground ruins had begun. They met with death and glory, but the old knowledge, the old rites, the old favor of the great ones had all been lost. Not all doors could be opened. The ironclad knights of Cainhurst were no match for the denizens of the labyrinth. She could not reach her ultimate prize, Queen Yarnan and her child of blood, waiting at the old capital. Scholars were brought from the outside to help with the exploration efforts, and Byrgenwerth was founded. It was built upon ground zero. They had a long way ahead of them if they were to unlock the secrets of the labyrinth, but they had a large pool of knowledge to draw from. Byrgenwerth's involvement with Cainhurst is hinted at by the shared bookcases of both libraries, both of which are different from the bookcases beneath Woodland Chapel. For instance, the abandoned learning institution is all around barren of ornaments and decorations, but it still finds itself paying homage to the crown which, as I have stated before, ruled over these lands. And the Byrgenwerth note that reads, "When the red moon hangs low, the line between man and beast is blurred, and when the great ones descend, a womb will be blessed with child," seems ominous enough as it is, meaning that Byrgenwerth would have been privy to the concept of a child of blood, but it's even worse when you consider the Japanese version of the game. In the Japanese version, the second sentence reads, "Idai naru josha ga arawareru, soshite warera akago wo idakan." A great one appears, and he will hold our baby. This is a sentence of archaic word expression. Idakan is originally idakamu. Idakamu is idakuto mu, and mu means guess. So, in the present expression, idakudaro. The person who wrote the note was wondering whether or not the Great One would accept the baby. Now, the blood drag's description, Queen Annalise partakes in these blood drag's offerings, so that she may one day bear the child of blood, the next vile blood heir, actually translates to Queen Annalise partakes in these blood drag's offerings, on the account of the vile bloods, who would be more accurately called blood relatives, dearest desire to hold the child of blood in their hands. The blood drag's version expresses their wish, but is almost like a prophecy when placed in the context of this note, from Byrgenwerth's point of view, wondering whether the prophecy will come to pass. And, as a brief side note, Higan, or dearest desire, is also used to describe Buddha's vow to save humanity. Discoveries were made, pacts were broken, friendships were lost. Undone by the blood. Through blood, everything is melted and reborn. Blood elevated Cainhurst to its new heights, but little did they know that blood would be both their deliverance and their undoing. The executioners had come. The last chapter in Cainhurst history. The vile bloods incited the ire of the church, and Logarius brought his band of executioners to the castle. Logarius himself was a Tumerian descendant. The Tumerians wielded powers based on arcane, fire and blood. Logarius carries a staff, like the one carried by the Tumerian Elder, who specialized on fire, a better choice when it came to cleansing the beasts of Loren. But Logarius' prey was one of a different sort. His powers can be emulated by the Executioner's Gloves, a secret treasure of Cainhurst, brought back from the labyrinth. Once, when his kin still inhabited the tombs of the gods, his forefathers executed defiled Tumerians and left behind only frenzied ghosts. This power was passed down through the generations, and it allowed the executioners to entrap the souls of the denizens of Cainhurst inside their weaponized wills. The ghosts roamed the castle, and Annalise would join their ranks, but even with his dreadful powers, she could not be killed, and if he couldn't cut the life out of her body, he would cut her existence out of this world. The Nightmare Frontier and Hunter's Nightmare are cursed lands that cannot be reached without being dragged into them, or, if you hold the right invitation in your hands, eldritch conductors might just take you there. Logarius couldn't kill the cursed queen, so he cast a curse upon these grounds. Now, this nightmarish frozen wasteland can only be reached by those with the right invitation, brought through a collapsed bridge over a barrier of water that surrounds all nightmares, in a carriage pulled by long dead horses. An eldritch transit to witness an eldritch liaison indeed. All is melted, reborn, undone. So, you may have noticed a lack of my usual video editing. Honestly, I literally don't have the time for that anymore, so I just had to compromise. And starting on the next video, it will probably be just me talking to the camera. It's the only way I can still get my theories out there. I hope it works, and I hope I'll still see all you guys out there. Well, thank you very much for watching. I would like to thank my patrons. I don't have many of them, but thank you very much, John and Vinny. Well, that's that, I guess. See you around.